what stays with you when you leave Taylor?
What stays with you when you leave Taylor? I think what stays with you is you have a new appreciation of the grandeur and size of this wild landscape. I mean, people see the word wilderness on a map, and they maybe have done some backpacks, and they've done, a 10 or 15-mile backpack, and that's, big country. But this is big wild country. There's a major trail down Big Creek, and boy, that's about it. And they will probably have seen wildlife and signs of wildlife or some carcasses from either wolf or cougar kill. So I really think that when people come out, they have a new appreciation for the grandeur and the remoteness of these uninhabited places. And we have a legal designation for that. It's called wilderness. A place where man as a visitor doesn't remain. A place that's untrammeled, which means uncontrolled by man. I mean, the biggest change in my career of going into there for 40 some years has been the fires. And fire is a natural part of the wilderness landscape, but it had been suppressed for many years. And so when we did have the fires of 2000, they were huge. I mean, they were 100,000 acre conflagrations. And so places that I remember hiking in dense dug forests are now barren. I mean, there's still black stems standing from 2000, standing that long. But the neat thing is, it's coming back. It's coming back slow. As you fly over it, you see a patchwork quilt of different shades of green, and that's called the natural vegetation mosaic. And that's where fires have, since the big 2000 fires, have spotted in, small lightning fires, and they burn for a while, and then they hit new growth, which is has more moisture and veg, and it's lower, and it drops. And so now we're starting to get that pattern back, and that's what supports wildlife too. But a huge change, a huge change has been the effect. I think more than 50% of that wilderness has burnt since 2000. That's a lot of fire. But it's kind of recycling things back to get into better condition.
That was a lot of fuel then.
Oh, gee. It was unbelievable. When the fire came through Taylor, Jim and Holly Aikenson, the managers, rode out and headed downstream. They got to the Middle Fork, and there were some people rafting that had stopped on the Middle Fork. And so they fed them and put them up. And then they went on upstream about, I can't remember, 11 miles or so to the Flying Bee. And the fire spotted ahead and came over there like 2 weeks later. And there were a commercial plane and a private plane flying over that country at the time that fire came in. And our manager was there helping to protect that place, and they had an air-to-ground radio. And the lookout, the Forest Service lookout on the south side of the Middle Fork said, "Holy cow, there's a fire of biblical proportions coming in. I'm out of here." So our people heard that. And then it did come in, and it created a firestorm where it's so hot and so much fire that branches and everything are being sucked up, and it reignites the carbon in the flame, and it goes even higher. So the commercial airline pilot was talking to a private pilot, and they were at 32,000 feet and saying, "The smoke column is going above us." And then they said, no one could survive that conflagration. And our manager was helping defend this ranch, and she had an air-to-ground radio, and she says, wait a minute, there are people down here, we're fighting the fire, we're still here, which was important. They got word out, and then, finally we were able to send people in. But those fires were, every bit as big and hot as the ones you see now in California, just 30,000 foot smoke columns. That's a big fire. But now we get to study that. We get to study how it comes back. And yeah, there's a lot to look at. It's caused landslides and all kinds of things. But it's coming back.
You mentioned how the environment has changed so much, and you seem to, you almost expressed how you felt a sense of loss, perhaps, and nostalgia for this Doug fir forest that had burned.
Yep.
But you're also fine with it, in that it's a part of the natural fire cycle.
Well, it is a part of the natural fire cycle, and to see it up close, but it was shocking. I mean, so when we would hike from Taylor Wilderness Research Station up to up to Cabin Creek, which is a Forest Service landing field, that was a little over 7 miles. We would hike, and I would say that 70% of that was in the shade of trees. And in fact, your legs would be wet because of the grass and the dew, because you'd usually start hiking in the morning. Now, 90% of that is right out in the sun, and there's big old burnt snags and things like that. I mean, that's pretty major. And Pioneer Creek comes down through Taylor Ranch, and that's about a 90,000 acre watershed. It's a basin, and I can't remember how high, but close to 9,000 to 10,000 feet high behind it. And more than 90% of that whole watershed that was completely covered with forest burnt. And so our big fear was that with big rainstorms and stuff, trees are gone, that's just going to come sliding down. I mean, there could be huge mass wasting events where you'd have a wall of water and debris and stuff coming down. So we contacted the USGS, and they've had people that have studied this process. And they flew in some scientists and experts that looked at the area and surveyed it. And for quite a few years after the fire, every cabin and tent had an aerosol can with a boat horn on it. And the instructions to every group that came in was, if there's a really bad thunderburst up in the high country, this could come washing down, and if you ever hear that, you don't try to go to the cookhouse, you just go any way to get uphill out of that little valley, and you blast that horn. And so this was a serious concern. In fact, we were really wondering, should we chance even bringing students in? But we didn't have big storms for a couple of years. We had some big storms, and it would flow dirty, but we weren't getting landslides. So I can't remember how many years, but maybe 4 or 5 years later, the USGS came back in, and they went up and were looking at it, and they said, we've never seen anything like this. They had seen huge mass wasting events after forest fires over on the Oregon coast and Northern California. But here it wasn't occurring, and the reason was there was so little soil. So the trees weren't on thick topsoil of any kind. The trees were growing in boulder fields and rocks. And so it's true that after about 7 to 9 years, those trees would start to fall and the roots would start to decay, but they weren't holding soil. And so we kept monitoring that. Pretty soon, I don't think you could find a boat horn in there anymore, but for about 5 to 7 years we were concerned and worried about it. But it also was, they just found that fascinating, that you could have that large of a drainage with so little soil that had supported this fairly old growth, primarily Doug fir forest. So yeah, things like that, you just don't know. You don't expect it until it, quote, happens.
Something similar did happen not too far away that formed Roosevelt Lake, right? There was a huge slide that dammed up that creek.
There's been many, places that this kind of thing has happened. But that has been remarkably stable. I mean, I don't fear it now. I mean, you have some amazing cloudbursts and you'll have some flooding. The other thing, though, that it pointed out, and we never thought about this, Pioneer Creek is there, and it's always been there, and it's a wonderful jewel. We have all these years been drinking the water out of Pioneer Creek with no need for any kind of treatment. We didn't get Giardia, we didn't get anything. For 70 some years, nobody caught anything from drinking that water. And so you think of that as a totally stable stream. But when the geologists from USGS went, they said, well, you realize this stream has been at 2 primary different locations and possibly 3. And you go, really? So this great big sloping meadow where we harvest our hay and stuff, Pioneer Creek's on one side. Well, on the other side, there's forest, but there's definitely a valley, and that's where it used to flow. So it has jumped back and forth. And in fact, what we call this beautiful hayfield and meadow is outwash. It's outwash from the 95,000 acres behind us. But it was in geologic time that it would be on one side and be on the other. And the one lady said, you know, someday you're going to have a big event and it's going to be going down there again. And we never crossed our mind that huge, 20 acres or so was deposited from outwash, and that the stream itself had moved back and forth in geologic time. That was fun to experience.
That's so interesting, because we tend to romanticize wilderness as this unchanging place, when in reality it's a very dynamic environment.
Oh, constantly changing. So the other huge effect that I have witnessed since 1979, and it's now 2022, when I first went in for a number of decades, there was almost no cheatgrass. In fact, I was with a forest ecologist, and he said, you see on these kind of sagebrushy blue bunch wheatgrass hillsides, he said, you see there's a couple big old trees, and you see that kind of looks like yellow something under them. He said, that's dead grass, and because of the moisture that the trees drip, that's cheatgrass. But he said, that's not a good thing. That stuff can spread. It's pernicious. It's all through the area, and it's just a major hazard. It has almost no nutritional value for any kind of stock or bighorn sheep or deer or anything. It's an invasive from Asia. It comes up before anything else germinates, and it germinates soon, and it's very thin. The grass is just really fine, thin. And so it germinates and dies, and so then it becomes dead and able to carry fire. And it's able to carry fire right about the time that the native grasses are coming up and inflorescing and being pollinated and spreading seed and stuff. So now we have across the West these massive cheatgrass fires that go ripping through. And it's not so bad just that they burn, but that they kill and suppress the native grasses. And so we just have cheatgrass everywhere there, up and down those drainages. And when I first started going in, there's very little of it. And that's a huge change. And then we have had, there's always been an invasion of noxious weeds, and along some of the trails. First everyone said, oh, it's backpackers with their vibrant souls. But no, it's in on drainages. It comes in on from birds. It comes in on the hair of elk and deer and stuff. And there's been some programs. The Forest Service has done some eradication programs to try to control it. But spotted knapweed is really a pernicious problem. And then there is some rush skeleton weed, which is also pretty bad. So and then cheatgrass and fire. Those are invasive species, or how do you say this? They can tolerate harsher conditions, so they often come in after disturbance. They're a disturbance-related species. And so things that have thorns and can grow other places kind of come in to replace stuff. And so I've seen a lot of change that way too. And so there's less for wildlife, less for people with stock. That's as big and pervasive in many ways as the fire has been.
Yeah, which suggests that as remote as wilderness is, it's still connected with the rest of the globe.
Yeah, you can't totally get away from it. Years ago, I'd have to look up the date, we got contacted by the Idaho National Engineering Lab. And I was at a conference they were doing, Idaho Falls or somewhere, and they were talking about they had these air quality monitoring stations in 12 of the most pristine air sheds on Earth. We're talking Antarctica, Patagonia, the Urals, mountains in Russia and stuff, the most pristine air sheds where hopefully there would be zero anthropogenic smoke, smog, or anything picked up. And I said to them after the presentation, I said, well, what about the Frank Church? And they said, oh, you can't do that. They said it's Forest Service wilderness, and you have to have this tripod, and you have to have solar panels and stuff like that do the sampling, and it has to be checked regularly year-round. And I said, we can do that. And they said, what? So it was, and this is the early 80s. This is like $125,000 apparatus they brought in and set this up. And I mean, it had a full MET station, meteorological station, and barometric pressure and all that, and recorded on a data logger. But it had this air quality sampling. It had these ceramic discs. So they were sucking air in to get the finest particulates that's measurable by man. I mean, we're talking microns. And then there was only 2 places in the nation we could send these. And I think Stanford had a place that could test for this, and I think the other might have been MIT, but our stuff was sent to Stanford. But I thought, wow, that's amazing. We have this air shed that's so far from any industry or anything. That's great. We have this clean air shed. And I started to think about, well, why do they want to monitor these pristine clean air sheds? Well, the reason they wanted to monitor is they wanted to be able to verify the nuclear armament treaties, because it would pick up any, strontium-90 or anything that was floating around if somebody's violating this. So nasty war actually funded the project that went on for quite a few years. But it is, I mean, think about it. Where can you go get a breath of a clean air? They told me that probably the last breath of clean air on Earth was in the early 1950s in the Antarctic, because from drilling core samples, ice below that, absolutely no anthropogenic contaminants. After that, nucleides and stuff start to show up. So, yeah, I mean, it's big, but it's still impacted by the outside world.
That was great. I didn't know that about the last breath of clean air. I suppose you could also melt an ice core and inhale some of that.
Well, so the other thing that has been done there is there has been 1 or 2 studies where they came in, and it's called paleoarchaeology, where they take core samples of the silt at the bottom of these high mountain lakes. And seasonally, you have striations, just like tree rings, where you have different flows in the spring and you have more things stirred up. But from that, you have pollen that settles out. And so from these mud cores, going back thousands of years, they can track the climatic conditions, because as the climatic conditions change, the tree species and stuff subtly change. And so there has been documented that there's been roughly a 300 to 400 year cycle of colder periods followed by 300 or 400 years of warmer periods. And students can actually see this when they hike down from the facility down Big Creek. There are places that there are some monster, I mean, we're talking 4 foot in diameter ponderosa pine, and almost right beside them will be equal size Douglas fir. Now, those two do not grow in the same conditions. Ponderosa pine, needs lots of sunlight. They're where the Doug fir is shade tolerant. And so how would you have something that needs hot, dry conditions to grow like a pea pine, and there's a Doug fir that needs wet, cool, shady conditions? Well, the answer is that probably one was at the start of one of those periods and the other came in as the period was changing. And so that's something to see, that they can just walk right by it on the trail.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. How are you surviving with the flies?
Yeah.
You see they're all attracted to this muff or cat.
That's great.
So it might be doing you a service.
Yeah.
Maybe quickly. So you got your PhD in '79, right? Which
78, 79, I can't remember. Yeah, technically it probably shows the 79.
And then in
At Colorado State University, yeah.
Right.
And I came,
so in 1980.
well, I was here in 79 in the spring semester.
Okay, right. And then so the following year, this region that Taylor sits in went from a primitive area, right, to the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness.
Right.
Did that entail any changes in how the land was managed, or?
Oh, that's a great question, because there was a lot of contention about that. And there were public hearings, and the dean asked me to go present in Grangeville, and it was at this huge meeting room, and I was probably the only person there that didn't have a cowboy hat on. But I talked to them about the advantages of wilderness, and that's one person asked me, well, how much more do we need? And I said, that's not the question. There is no more. There will only be less wilderness. So we need to take care of what we've got, and because there won't be more. It's a matter of how much less can we stand. And so they grudgingly nodded and smiled, but not a lot of change, other than the Forest Service. When it became wilderness, then there's some additional regulation and things that we had to adhere to, or that they were concerned about. Were we causing an impact and stuff? But not a great change.